All right, Chelsea fans, welcome back to another episode. That's right, of the London is Blue podcast. Hopefully, your favorite Chelsea podcast out there and a part of the Men in Blazers Media Network. Dan, one of your hosts here, with a little bit of an end of the week update pod, recorded on Thursday, October 31st, Halloween here. Potentially some treats in this episode, no tricks, because it is a match preview with good friend Sam, CFC Central, to break down the Manchester United match review. Maybe, though, the biggest trick played on all of us, Sam, was the hope, the dream, the opportunity, the desire to face Erik Ten Hag one more time, to put him to the sword and to send him off for Manchester United. And they would not let us have that good time. He is no longer a part of the club. He is no longer a part of the institution. He is no longer a part of the Premier League. Erik Ten Hag, we hardly knew ye, and we will not get an opportunity. We will not get the goodness of one last treat against Manchester United and him managing that team. I guess, how disappointed are you in that one?
I don't know if he did anything close to managing during his time there, to be honest. But I was hoping for one last hurrah. I would have absolutely loved to play this United at Old Trafford, and I think would have presented our best opportunity in terms of breaking that infamous record we have in not winning for like a decade there in the league. So yeah, I'm quite sad. And obviously, you put together a preview pod thinking you've got everything sorted, and then you suddenly have to go through your sporting notes and have to figure out, what Van Nistelrooy's coaching resume looks like. So it's been a lot of work which United make me do, but hopefully it'll be sort of academic in the end, and we can finally take 3 points.
That is the most important thing. We definitely want to hit that doorbell in Old Trafford and have them place the 3 points in our bundle and allow us to walk back or head back to Stamford Bridge and London with all 3 of those points. But look, we're going to get into what to expect from this Manchester United side in terms of the style of play. And again, I think some of this with the managerial change is going to be a little up in the air. So some additional guesswork required in this podcast. Talk about where some of the weaknesses are with this team currently. And then we'll take a look at some of the decisions Enzo Maresca is going to have to make, which may have changed given the midweek results, and also an eye on the Conference League fixture coming up as well. But before we do that, as always, a little bit of quick admin out of the way. Just thank everybody who supports the podcast. If you can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that's always appreciated if you're listening to the audio version. If you're on YouTube, or if you're not on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Get involved. Less than half the people watch a video are subscribed. So you should do that if you haven't yet. You also can like and comment on the video and hit the bell icon to get notified when we drop new content there, like our Chelsea women's updates that we've been putting out there, some additional specific content on YouTube. It's YouTube exclusive. You also can sign up to get our free weekly newsletter. It's a London is Blue Dispatch written by Sam every single week. Some goodness in your inbox, and doesn't cost you anything. You also can sign up for our free or paid version or our Discord community as well to get involved in the conversation. But Sam, it's a Manchester United team that is not seeing the same type of goodness that Chelsea is seeing at this point in time. It's a Manchester United team that is in ownership transition, in identity crisis potentially, and very much a group of supporters that probably feel like where Chelsea supporters were even 3 to 5 months ago about how we were feeling about our club. Can't feel good in 14th place on 11 points where they're at this moment.
Yeah, I think they're quite deep in it, and I want to be as neutral and unbiased as possible. But I spoke to a couple of Manchester United fans who are good friends of mine, and I pointed out this thing saying, look, he's bought Anthony, De Ligt, Mazraoui, a lot of people from the Dutch league, guys who played with him at Ajax, and suddenly you fired the manager. What wiggle room do you have left in terms of spending and giving Amorim, the resources that he needs to rebuild? It feels like you put all your eggs in the basket and somebody sat on it. So it's definitely, I think, a kind of situation that maybe Kohli and Co were facing when they came into the club, when we made those Koulibaly, Aubameyang, Kukureya signings, and figured out that after 2023, we definitely have to sort of make those changes, take those hard calls, find an out, and maybe take hits on a lot of players and sell as much as we can to rebuild from scratch. And I think that's the kind of radical squad building they'll have to go through to be where they want to be with Amarim. But yeah, overall speaking, we can only maybe in this preview take an over the top view in terms of what has happened so far, what's gone right, what's gone wrong, and hopefully try and pinpoint what Van Nistelrooy will do on the sample size of one game, which they had against Leicester in the Cup. So wish me luck.
Well, we are trying not to wish you luck because I don't think you ever need it in these type of scenarios because you just always tend to get it done. I mean, just when you talk about that league form, it's pretty unfortunate. I mean, it's a negative goal difference for Manchester United side. I mean, we've seen some of the on the bounce performances previously in other seasons where they've been equal or that, flat goal difference. This one, 8 goals scored, so 0.89 per game. They've allowed in 11, so -3 goal difference there. Though, when you look at the expected goals and expected goals allowed, 14.6 and 15 respectively. So they would argue that they should be closer on the balance there. Just in terms of the matches that they've played, I mean, they did have that 5-2 win against Leicester City here in the Cup, but they've also had some losses against Brighton 2-1, Liverpool 3-0, Tottenham 3-0, West Ham 2-1. I mean, that was probably the one that felt the weirdest to me. Plenty of draws in the Europa League, as it were. A couple wins there. Very inconsistent team. I guess if I was going to look at a word, or one or two words to describe them, Sam, I think like inconsistent and underperforming would maybe be the way to think about this team, just in terms of their identity.
Absolutely. And I think they've been that way ever since like Ole was in charge, where you really didn't know what you were going to get. It was like a mystery box. And a lot of the times you'd see them in the absolute like pits of despair in terms of can't figure out how to put three passes together, and then suddenly they'll go to like Manchester City and get a result. So that kind of trend with United's DNA, I think, has continued, and which is why I treat this fixture with utmost respect. I'm not looking at it and saying, "Wow, it's an opportunity to like bite into them and rip them to shreds." It's definitely going to be much tougher than that, but inconsistent is a really good place to start, I believe. Yeah, unpredictable sort of fits a little better for me, so that's the word I'm going with.
And then any of those initial results that you think if someone had the time and wanted to subject themselves to the maybe pain and torture of watching this United team, or maybe could reduce that by watching just the highlights that you feel like would be a way to define who this team is and give you the best idea of identity? Would it just be those League Cup updates in the Leicester match, or would you look at any other one as a recommendation for somebody if they wanted to do their own homework?
Well, for this one, obviously, because it was Van Nistelrooy's first game in charge, I had to watch the Leicester game to figure out like what the ideas were. Obviously, it's short turnaround time. He'd also benched a lot of players who he would normally start. So I'm taking this with a massive pinch of salt to say like it's probably nothing like what we'll face in the league. And I just went back in terms of I've seen them already through a lot of performances, but I went through Aston Villa 0-0 to figure out what went right for them that game in terms of defense, because that's been a big question mark for them under Ten Hag. So it's again like there are some good things, but mostly the bad things have dominated. And there's also this factor of luck, which we always say like sort of manifests itself through numbers. It's the finishers that they have at the club haven't really like clicked. A lot of the devastating numbers that Rashford and Bruno were putting through for the longest time sort of eviscerated and just been blown to miss. So they're now, like currently as of this moment, the worst side in the Premier League in terms of underperformance on their expected goals. They're 6.5 goals short, which is a massive, massive underperformance. But you should also know that this means that they're generating very good numbers. They're just not finishing it off. And mathematics sort of states that inevitably it comes to the mean. It sort of finds a way to get back to where it needs to be. So You don't want that to happen against your side.
Well, let's hope that that is not the case. We're going to get our first ad break out of the way. When we come back, we're going to talk about just the style of play of this team, maybe what we should expect, along with some of the weaknesses of this really interestingly assembled squad. But stay tuned and we'll be right back. Okay, Sam. So I know the job became more difficult when we lost out on the Aaron Ten Hag pinata party, but why don't you run me through a couple of the things that we should consider from either the formation or maybe some of the ways that we should anticipate the players, the Manchester United players, in terms of how they might get deployed in this match?
Yeah, so just to sort of maybe try and guess, Minnesota is probably not going to change too much. They've been very consistent the way that they've started. It's always been a 4-2-3-1, which morphs into a 4-2-4 or a 4-4-2 out of possession. And mostly then, like the out of possession structure isn't really geared towards pressing super aggressively and going after people, but it's more about trying to stifle any passes in central areas. So they like to sit off and sort of spring pressing traps and essentially win the ball in those tight areas and then use those quick attackers that they have to try and hit you on the break in those dangerous areas. Some of the numbers that I saw from Marca Stats, who's like this really, really good account on X, and he's got his own website in terms of numbers. So I was looking at opposition possession numbers, like which teams are very good at making the opposition lose the ball through, you know, pressure or just tackling and defensive actions. And United figured like their numbers are exactly the same as Liverpool. So they might not have like a very aggressive press, but they do indirectly force you to make mistakes, which is something that you definitely need to keep in mind. And their ball winning numbers also sort of tell you that they're top for tackles won and tackle success percentage in the league. So they're very successful at basically, going after dribblers and winning the ball back. It shouldn't really like be indicative of anything more than that, just that they've been very good at quantity and quality of tackling and defensive actions against quicker threats. But that's the game plan in its bare essence, where the point is to maybe like push a little deeper, force the opposition to sort of bait into coming towards you and then use that space to your advantage. And especially when you've got wide runners like Rashford and Garnacho, and you've got a couple of very clever passers like Ericsson and Bruno and Mainu, then you can try and exploit that very, very quickly. So that's probably going to be the game plan. The center forward, they've got two completely different profiles there. So how they function will probably, in an ideal sense, depend on who's starting in that number nine position. If it's Rasmus Højlund, then there are going to be a lot of long balls in behind into the flanks. If, for example, one of the fullbacks like Gusto or James are inverting into midfield, then expect Manchester United to try and put a long ball in that pocket for Højlund to run and chase off and sort of hold it up for other people. While with Xerxes, who I believe is not a centre forward at all, he's more like a 9.5. So he'll essentially like to drop, and he's all about those little layoffs and trying to bring people into play. He's not very physical. He's not sensational in the air, despite being, I think, 6'4". So you have to be sort of switched on to two completely different profiles of centre forwards, which I think makes them quite an interesting proposition. Uh, in terms of how they like to build up, they're not very reliant on it, I would say. Not a side that actively tries to, do things that we are trying to like bait the press or play through pressure. They're more about being, very quick with it, very efficient. So the most, I would say, used ploy is to go to this 3-2, which changes with the personnel that are in the midfield too. For example, sometimes Diego Dallo will invert from the defense into midfield. Sometimes it's Mainu and Ericsson. Sometimes Bruno pops in there. So the point is not to go directly through pressure to them, but to go out wide and from those wide areas to Masraoui or to Gallo or to one of the centre backs, they try to essentially find long balls in behind for Rashford or Garnacho down the line. So they'd look for long balls down the wing. Otherwise, they like to try and find Mainu in the little pockets in the center, and from there, they will try and create issues in those central gaps. So again, it's not a side that will come to play. Their average possession is closer to 50 than it is to the top sides. So that's something that you have to be aware of. Like if they're not keeping the ball, they probably prefer it to be that way. And the last thing I probably need to point out is that it's a very new look defense. Delict has come in, Euro has come in. He's injured, so will not feature. Mazraoui has come in, so it is pretty good in terms of box defending. It's a quite physical defense in that sense. Pretty good dueling, but yeah, outside of it is where, there are multiple question marks in terms of what the balance is and how the entire defense has been assembled. So that's going to be, I think, the key point for me is how you can exploit that imbalance and lack of sort of insight into building a good defense.
And I think when you talk about things like the defense, I know that people had pointed at Onana as potentially not doing a great job at points of last season, and feels as if they're probably in a better goalkeeping position than Chelsea are at this point in time, and maybe have had more luck defensively than we've had in terms of those just kind of individual errors that have cropped up to cost Chelsea some pretty large, I think, point benefits here or advancement into the next round of a cup competition. Looking at maybe one defender in the most recent game, but it feels as if they could be a little stubborn in the defensive regard. And particularly with the idea of like a new manager bounce, that always gets into people's head a little bit. And we probably just don't have enough view maybe necessarily on how much that is going to carry over, considering that manager handoff too.
Yeah, I would agree with that point, but I would also like to emphasize, Dan, that players don't change overnight. So their weaknesses will remain weaknesses in terms of just individual quality. So I think that's something that Maresca needs to focus on, knowing that certain players will have, inherent weaknesses that have been exploited over and over again. And a better structure will probably nullify them to an extent. It's just trying to figure out, where the concession is, because it's whenever you make a move to hide something, a gap appears elsewhere. So that's going to be, I think it'll take Maresca maybe like 10, 15, 20 minutes to see how the setup is, where things are happening, where the gaps are. But yeah, that's what makes the game a little tricky for me. But I do believe like the defensive imbalance, like I talked about, the profiles there, the way that they've been exploited in the first games in the Premier League, I think that will remain consistent. And we will talk more about the weaknesses section, which I think will still be relevant in the game tomorrow.
Yeah, and then when it comes to those weaknesses, I mean, you could pick the ones that you want to go with. I mean, if we feel like the defense and the way that they set up or structure is a way to get at them, I think maybe on how the team is conditioned to play and if those players are actually capable of executing kind of in a high pressure kind of high intensity game. It does feel like this side is maybe where Chelsea fans felt like we were at, 1 to 2 to even 3 windows ago, where the identity or the type of football we want to try to execute is not in consort with the players and personnel we have. So maybe to your point, like players not changing overnight, maybe there's a ask of them that is just unrealistic in terms of executing the style of play. Would that be maybe a way to kind of frame the weaknesses element?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Leicester game was a perfect response to what you just said, because, I expected maybe a different structure, something to sort of go on. Obviously, a little bit optimistic of me, but yeah, they essentially have got great attackers there. Garnacho is making his reputation as an exciting winger. Rashford is obviously a proven PL goal scorer. I think he turns 27 today, so peak of his powers. And they ended up scoring five. And in those five goals, they also conceded two absolute doozies in terms of like what were you doing in that situation. And that's been, I think, the issue over and over again. Like it's either the attack doesn't work and the defense comes trumps, and then the inverse happens and you still end up dropping points. So again, with the defense, they've conceded, I think, the same number of goals as us in the league, Dan, 11. But their best player has arguably been Onana, who's been very, very good after a tough start to life at Old Trafford. And despite United being top for the quality of shots that their defense has conceded, which is post-shot expected goals per shot is 0.40, which is an absurdly high amount for any goalkeeper to face. He's still done well, and they've essentially outperformed their defensive numbers by a very good margin. So that's the thing. Like their attack is underperforming, the defense is overperforming. So, how do you look at this side? And I think Leicester was a good answer of maybe like what will happen. Attackers getting a lot more freedom, but the defense also opening up and conceding goals that they shouldn't at this point in the season.
And then, if we think about just, is there kind of a challenge within, how they maintain structure, how they win back the ball, or, maybe just, we've kind of pointed to our midfield being an issue. And what's their midfield kind of like at the moment? Is that an area where we can kind of get at them in terms of what Maresca might be thinking about?
Yeah, so the configuration has definitely sort of thrown a spanner into works. And the first thing that I would love to address or talk about is the defensive line. And I think if you look at the personnel, Dan, the defensive line is sorely lacking a semblance of recovery speed. And that creates a paradox. It creates sort of like a psychological divide, which I think is the root of United's issues. So if the defense tries to maintain a high line, and in that line you've got Delict, Maguire, Evans, Lisandro, or Mazraoui, then it's not a quick backline at all. And any quick attacker that's able to make runs in behind is going to offer all kinds of issues. And if you get 1v1 in those situations, then I don't think any of those guys is stopping any attacker running in behind. So I think a fear factor is there in terms of being a little too high. So what they've done, the defensive line, is they've tried to keep either a medium at best or a low defensive line. So in terms of numbers, they're I think ninth or 10th lowest in the league this season, with around like 43 meters, one of those things. So it's quite a low um, defensive line. And what that tends to do, Dan, is when your midfield is asked to press and win the ball, it creates an ocean of gap between your midfield and defensive line. Like there's a lot of space for the opposition midfielders to drop and receive and turn. And this is something that I noticed Morgan Rogers did for Aston Villa, Dominic Szoboszlai did for Liverpool, even Bilal El Khanous did for Leicester. All of them did it with an alarming amount of ease and with an incredible amount of frequency, where they just dropped in that corridor of uncertainty between Manchester United's reluctant centre backs and their midfielders. So that creates a lot of issues for them. I would ask Cole Palmer, I would ask Nico Jackson to exploit those spaces as much as possible, and that's something that troubles them on an everyday basis. The second is something that maybe like we are a lot familiar with. It was last season. It was just the amount of pressure that's placed on the midfield pivots in terms of trying to provide defensive support, trying to provide thrust in midfield, trying to help out in build up. So all these responsibilities are placed on these two guys in the middle of the park. So you have to cover an incredible amount of distance. You're shunting back and forth, and that itself brings secondary factors that um, make your job a little difficult to do. Like for example, Kobe Mainu, his defensive numbers now are off the charts. Like his output is very good, but he's covering more ground than he's ever before. I think sooner rather than later, I wouldn't be surprised if he picks up like an injury. Um, he's also got a defensive partner in Ericsson and Casemiro before Ugarte, where it was tough to find good defensive balance. And essentially, their midfield used to get bypassed on transition all the time. And because of that, his discipline issues have popped up. So he's now one game away from a suspension with like 4 yellow cards, and he had three in all of last season in 24 games. So it's a lot more open for him. He's getting I would say, a decent amount of the ball, but he's also asked to do an incredible amount of defensive work, which it's not ideal. It's what Caicedo does as well for us, and you would rather have a more settled, more comfortable pivot partnership where the workload is shared, and especially somebody who's as ball heavy and has a high affinity for possession like Kobe Mino, you would want him to be a little more relaxed on the ball, and that's something that he hasn't been able to do. So you can overload those pivots, and there are moments when it happens, like Kobe Mino will push up with the ball, he will try to support Rashford on the wing, and that leaves Casemiro or Eriksen or Ugarte completely by himself in midfield. And combine that with the fact that you know they the centre backs don't like to step up, then you've got a major issue. So I think it's very similar to what we saw with Newcastle, where we pointed out that Burn would struggle to try and close down people. Bruno Guimaraes would push up. That's the exact situation that will probably happen with United, which I'm guessing will happen no matter what Mr. Roy does. So that's something to keep in mind. And the last thing then is probably the caveat to their ball winning numbers being strong is that they can be prone to being sort of bypassed when they try to press high. So they've got a good amount of industrious players, but there are a couple of doubts in people's minds in terms of committing. So we mentioned the midfield having like two responsibilities, one being, providing pressing support, but also making sure that you're screening your defense. So when that dilemma happens, then inevitably you're caught between two places at most times. Also, when Xerxes plays, I think he's quite ineffectual in terms of pace, in terms of just being in the right position defensive wise. So the pivot that Xerxes is trying to shadow in their 4-2-4, um, he's the guy who will probably find the most amount of space. So you probably want the ball to go wide in our build-up, and then whoever the pivot is that Xerxes marking, ask him to make a run forward and find a little pocket to receive. And I'm pretty sure Xerxes won't track back. So those are the weaknesses that I foresee. And like I mentioned, Dan, these things won't change overnight unless there's an incredible amount of incentive to say, work 100% harder and show a part of a game that you haven't shown before, which coincidentally is exactly what a new manager bounce does. So fingers crossed that they've got all their goals out of the way against Leicester and have none left for us at Old Trafford.
That would be the most ideal outcome. We're going to take our last ad break. When we get back, we're going to start to think about what are the questions that Enzo Maresca has to consider and have an answer for as it relates to this match. But we're going to do that after this ad break. So stay tuned and we'll be right back. Okay, Sam, it's always the opportunity in the preview pod to flip the script a little bit, as it were, and to throw some questions my way and see if we are on the same page or if we're reading from a different book altogether when it comes to what we think Enzo Maresca is going to do with the top questions that he has to address with this matchup. So why don't you fire a few at me here and see if we are aligned or not?
Oh, definitely. My favorite part of the preview pod recently, so I'm definitely going to take full advantage. But the first question is arguably to do with what I think is, United's biggest threat factor, which is their wide forwards or the wingers in Garnacho and Rashford. So who are you picking? Are you picking Cucurella or are you picking Gusto at left back to cater to that threat?
Ooh, I mean, given he played midweek, I still think Cucurella is the choice I would have. I just feel like you want to play people in their natural positions as much as possible. And if so, we have a left back in Cucurella versus Gusto deputizing as a left back and then Reece James on the right hand side. It does feel like that's the right idea. I mean, just call me crazy, but I feel like if you have a player in the necessary position and you can get them to go up against the attacker on their appropriate flank, it does feel like that's the right call. Maybe that changes based upon who the attacker is up front, but we've also seen Maresca comfortably deploy Gusto as a left back and Reece James as a right back. I do feel as if it makes more sense to go Cucurella and Reece James if we're talking about the left back and right back scenario. But you can let me know what you think, Sam.
Yeah, it is an interesting headache, to be honest. And I do think that maybe Maresca does like that inverted fullback sort of trend coming in again. And with Reece slotting in as the third centre back on the right flank, then I believe Gusto might be the one who might be preferred. And obviously, Cucurella did play the last game, so I imagine Maresca might be tilting his head towards that choice in this particular context. I don't think it's much to do with like defensive capabilities as such. It's probably just looking at the dynamics of the system and figuring out if you do want that extra player in midfield, then it's definitely worth going Gusto over Cucurella because Gusto has had experience as a central midfielder. So that's, I think, the separating factor. But he's thrown a complete curveball at us before then, so I wouldn't set this in stone.
Yeah, it does feel as if this is one of the couple positions on the pitch where it could go either way and could come down to just how Kukure looks in terms of training, fitness level, readiness to go back into this match. I wouldn't be surprised if either scenario happens. Like, I think this very much could be like a 50-50 shot. And, I
Mhm.
do think as long as Reece James is healthy, he is starting in the right back position. So then it just becomes a question of, 50-50%, is it going to be Cucurella or Gusto? If I were to put a stamp on what I prefer, I think it's Cucurella. If I'm going to go with what I think actually happens, I feel like we're going to see Gusto again. But that's just my way
Nice.
of splitting it.
Base is covered. Base is covered in the weekend of the World Series. Well done, Dan.
Well, I mean,
I
look. I
admire the
mean,
diplomacy.
preference, and projection or prediction can be two different things, and I'm just making sure that people are
Agreed.
aware. I am making a claim to both of them. I'm not leaving myself in the middle of the on the fence here.
Wise man, always. The second position that you mentioned is maybe like up for grabs because this is interesting, Dan. Now you've got two fullbacks at Manchester United who often switch. So Mazraoui can play left back and right back, and Dalot can also play both flanks. So considering both are, I think, slightly susceptible to defensive issues, who are you starting on the left flank? We still don't know. Like when I talked about this before the board, like is Sancho cup tied or because like he's ineligible to play against his club because he's still on loan or does it change as an obligation? I still don't know. But um, if it's a toss up between Mikhailo Mudryk, who's been quite impressive the last two games, arguably our best player against Newcastle in the cup, and also had a very good game at Panathinaikos, is it him or is it the well rested Neto that you would take on the left hand side?
Oh, I mean, I think it's got to be Neto, right? I mean, you would love to have Jadon Sancho available in this game. That's not going to happen, unfortunately. Well, he would potentially have to wait until next season to get his revenge. Though he did enjoy the Instagram posts with the black background and hand wave emoji. So maybe highlighting how he felt about Aaron Ten Hag leaving Manchester United. I don't know. I could just be adding unnecessary levels of understanding or interpretation to that Instagram post. But it does feel like this is maybe just a step up in expectation. And while Mudryk has found, I think, some goodness in our Conference League fixtures, and is starting to find, I think, a little more comfort. I mean, getting some more praise from Enzo Maresca after potentially being also told that he is a little further behind from a winger perspective and where he needs to be. It does feel like you want to go Premier League proven, a little more consistent, and Neto on the left hand side with Madueke on the right and Cole Palmer centrally with Nico Jackson up top feels like the best type of attack that we could put out there.
I think it's definitely a very strong case, and we all of us talked about this in the post game pod about Cole Palmer in the Newcastle League game taking up a quite rare left-sided position, which I think was in response to Gusto sort of pushing up into the right attacking midfielder slot. So it aligned very very nicely, and I had my doubts about Palmer in that position, sort of with his angle bias and stuff, but with Neto giving him the width on the left hand side, it worked very well. And I think what I really liked about Neto's performance is there was no underlapping from Greece. There was no support whatsoever from that left side position, and he still took on Livramento a couple of times. He found that inclination to go diagonally towards the centre back. And I would also like to point out that, you know, in my humble opinion, the weaker of United centre backs is definitely Matthias de Ligt compared to if it's going to be Lisandro who starts at left, then I would target De Ligt on the ground. So if it's somebody like a Neto who's comfortable going both ways, then yeah, it feels like on the basis of the last performance, you would want him there. But this is a great headache for me to have, Dan, in terms of having somebody who's knocking on the door saying, I'm ready to play for the 18. That's exactly the point of,
Mhm.
rotating your 11 for the cup fixture to have these kind of headaches. Unfortunately, we had a migraine of the wrong sort, and this is probably the nicest headache that you can have on the left hand side, and I'm happy with either one, to be honest.
And do you think there are other considerations? Particularly after midweek, it definitely feels like the Caicedo Lavia midfield pairing is most likely. I don't think we're going with Jorgensen as a potential shock option in goal. I mean, it does feel like the Premier League 11, very unlikely to be adapted in this scenario. I think it is going to be the strongest available situation. And maybe the question is, can Cole Palmer and Nico Jackson continue their fine attacking form against this side and continue to, do better in terms of their goal contributions relative to the entirety of the Manchester United team?
Yeah, I think I would have two observations then to sort of like finish. The one is like great that you pointed out the pivot partnership. Um, I thought like Maresca used Enzo in a really interesting way. I saw a lot of people snapping at me saying Enzo was so horrible against Newcastle in the Carabao Cup. I think there's a difference between what the idea is and what the execution was. The execution wasn't great, but you saw Enzo against what I would say is a very, very good Newcastle midfield with ideally not, the perfect pivot partner in Renato Vega. And he managed 121 passes and he had a lot of the ball. He didn't have to underlap. He didn't have to push himself into positions where he would struggle to recover. And I think that's how you should use Enzo Fernandez. It's how he's used Romeo Lavia, Maresca. That is how you should be looking at Enzo. You should be exactly using him in the same mold, not trying to, convert him into something he's not. So if he's used in the same way, then in my mind, I really don't mind if either of them starts. I think both of them have quite similar skill sets. Both of them are very press resistant. I think Lavia is slightly better in terms of like getting away from pressure in those central areas. Maybe Lavia doesn't have the more expansive passing range that Enzo has in advanced areas, but it's a neck and neck for me. I think both have the same weaknesses. So I'm fine with either one. I think Lavia starts this one because Lavia, I think, started almost every single preseason game he was available for. So maybe Maresca has a set idea in his head thinking this is how it goes for me. So maybe that's what we see. Liverpool was a curveball. I thought Enzo would start, but obviously Lavia started that one. But I do think this happens then. And the last thing I'd probably like to say is something that has been bugging me. I would say it's maybe a tactical thing that you will have to be careful of when Xerxes comes on. So the issue that happens with him and say versus Erasmus Hoyland is with Hoyland it's straightforward. You have to keep an eye on him making runs off your shoulder into space. So you have to be quick. You have to just make sure that you catch him offside or you at least keep up with him, which is pretty straightforward in my opinion for West Fofana and Levi Colwill. What Xerxes does is that he drags one of your center forwards out, sorry, center backs out. So he will drop close to the halfway line. He will drop as much as possible, and one of those two guys has to step up. And whenever that has happened in the past games, then it's Rashford or Garnacho or Ahmad making runs towards the other centre back. And you don't want, say, Rashford running 1v1 against Colville for a long ball. You don't want Garnacho or Ahmad with their pace, with their trickery running at Colville all by themselves in those positions. So that's something that I feel like if Xerxes comes on or if he starts, that's something that you have to keep a very, very close eye on because we do play a relatively high line and we do press quite high, even on goal kicks. And if the press is not good enough, one long ball in behind for one of those runs could spell trouble. So that's something that I would keep a huge watch on because it's a very, very dangerous ploy that United use.
Well, do we want to make any predictions here about the result, or do you feel like we've gotten into too much trouble recently about some of the results and outcomes here? I mean, we did pretty well over the 3 match run here of Panathinaikos, Newcastle, and the League Cup match. I mean, I think we did say that 2 out of 3 felt like the reality, and that did come to fruition. But we can swerve on the prediction if you don't want to make one.
Now, may I just toot my horn a little bit and say that I've got at least one of the scores right in the past 6 games, either the ones that we've scored or the ones that we've conceded. So feel like I'm on a good run. So I will probably take hazard a guess at this. If it was Erik Ten Hag, I would probably have gone like maybe 3-1 in our favor. I was that confident. Now I'll probably say like maybe a 2-1, but I wouldn't be surprised if, we go there and we put in a very good performance. I think it happens. I'm feeling very confident about it. What about you, Dan? Similar optimism?
Oh,
You and I are of the same cloth. So
I don't think we can ever get away with, unfortunately, a clean sheet at this present time. I feel something like really weird, like a 3-2 win, just a little bit more higher scoring, a little bit of defensive calamity from this side. Robert Sanchez maybe making a errant pass here or there. Cole Palmer continuing to build upon his fine form. I feel like there should be a response from this Chelsea team, particularly with who is the first team and what do they stand for? What does Maresca, make in terms of the way that he sets up his team, he inspires his team. I think anytime you have away supporters kind of traveling for a fixture like this, I mean, you want to show them a really good time and show them a really good performance. And that's not what the away supporters got when they went to St. James's Park this midweek. So you feel like there should hopefully be an appropriate level of response here. And I feel like this could be a very fun match and hopefully high scoring on our end. And maybe we just don't give the result away. That's the biggest concern I have is I feel like it's our mistakes will allow United to potentially find a way into this game, not United being good enough to do it themselves.
definitely, I think that's a concern I share as well. And again, the devil kind of situation where it's just lots of question marks in terms of what to expect and who will start. It's just all over the place. Casemiro has been on fire, but again, if he starts, I'm a lot more confident. I'm just making guesses and I'm trying to figure if, for stability's sake, Root goes with what he's seen and he feels like he can improve that in terms of execution. But hopefully, we'll have that figured out in the first 15 minutes then. And if we do that quality for quality, I think I think we take this. Fingers crossed.
Well, let's hope that is how it nets out here and Chelsea pick up 3 points and continue a very strong start to the Premier League part of the season here. But that's going to do it for this preview episode. So thank you so much to you who have listened or watched. Thank you so much to help for supporting the podcast and enjoy the match. We will be live after it on YouTube. So don't forget to join us there for this one. But until next time, Chelsea fans, you know what to do. Keep the blue flag flying high.